In the quiet suburbs of California during the 1970s, a predator moved under the cover of darkness. He slipped through unlocked windows, crept silently across sleeping lawns, and left entire communities in a state of paralyzing fear. Known by many names, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer, this man would terrorize the state for more than a decade, leaving behind shattered families, broken communities, and a trail of unsolved mysteries that haunted law enforcement for 40 years. The Golden State Killer wasn't just a criminal. He was an orchestrator of fear, a figure whose methodical cruelty redefined what it meant to feel unsafe in your own home. His attacks weren't random, spur-of-the-moment crimes. They were planned with military precision. He stalked his victims, memorized their routines, and turned their most private spaces into hunting grounds. The story begins in Sacramento in the mid-1970s, where a series of assaults against women began to rise. At first, they were brushed aside as tragic but isolated incidents. But as the assaults grew more frequent, police began to see a pattern, a terrifying one. Women living in quiet, middle-class neighborhoods reported a masked man breaking in at night, binding them and subjecting them to hours of psychological torment. He was meticulous. Before an attack, he would prowl the area for days, peering into windows, studying families, and leaving subtle signs of his presence. Sometimes victims would report strange phone calls before an attack. Other times, household items would be mysteriously moved, as if someone had been inside but left no trace. The first wave of his terror became known as the East Area Rapist attacks. Between 1976 and 1979, at least 50 assaults were attributed to him in the Sacramento area. His victims ranged from young women living alone to mothers at home with their children. What made him particularly chilling was his ability to completely dominate and control the environment once inside a home. He often entered through sliding glass doors or pried open windows. Once inside, he bound his victims with shoelaces or ropes, sometimes using items he found in the home itself. He blindfolded them, gagged them, and created an atmosphere of helplessness that left survivors traumatized for decades. But it wasn't just the assaults themselves, it was the psychological games he played. He whispered threats, made his victims believe he might kill them at any moment, and sometimes lingered for hours after the assault, rummaging through refrigerators or quietly pacing around the house while they lay terrified in their bindings. At first he seemed to focus on women who lived alone, but soon his violence escalated. Couples became his new targets. He would force the man to lie face down, binding him tightly, often stacking dishes on his back as a crude alarm system. Then he would lead the woman into another room, committing his crimes while her partner lay helpless, knowing any movement might cause the dishes to fall and cost them both their lives. By the late 1970s, his attacks spread beyond Sacramento, striking fear into communities across California. The press gave him a chilling moniker, the East Area Rapist. Neighborhoods organized community patrols. Families armed themselves and slept with weapons by their beds. And yet, no one could stop him. Then, just as abruptly as the assaults had begun, they seemed to end in Northern California. For a while, residents dared to hope he had been caught or moved on. But in reality, he was only escalating further, evolving into something far deadlier. In 1979, the attacks began again, this time in Southern California. But now they had transformed into murders. Couples were found bludgeoned or shot in their own homes. The East Area Rapist had become the original Night Stalker. His methods were chillingly similar: binding, stalking, and psychological domination. But now he left no survivors. Over the next several years, he was linked to at least 13 murders and dozens of assaults across the state. His ability to evade capture became almost legendary. Police departments across California struggled to coordinate information in an era before digital databases, and he seemed to stay one step ahead at all times. One of his most infamous crimes occurred in 1980 when a couple in Goleta was murdered in their own home. Neighbors reported hearing screams, followed by silence. When police arrived, they found the victims bound and brutally killed. The crime scene bore the same marks as the East Area Rapist's earlier attacks, but this time, the violence had reached its peak. The murders continued into the mid-1980s. Victims ranged from young couples to middle-aged professionals, and the brutality was always staggering. The killer seemed to thrive on control, carefully orchestrating each attack to maximize fear before delivering the fatal blow. By the late 1980s, the killings mysteriously stopped. Investigators were left with only questions. Had he been imprisoned under another name? Had he died? Or was he simply living quietly, satisfied that he had escaped justice? The mystery grew colder with each passing year, even as the families of victims pleaded for answers. For decades, the case remained unsolved. Countless detectives devoted their careers to hunting the man known as the Golden State Killer. but the evidence was too thin, the trail too cold. The crimes had taken place across multiple jurisdictions, creating a labyrinth of files and reports that made building a single profile difficult. Then, in the early 2000s, a breakthrough in forensic science began to offer new hope. DNA evidence, preserved from the crime scenes, was retested using modern technology. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Investigators confirmed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. The separate monikers finally merged into one terrifying identity: the Golden State Killer. Still, the man's true name remained elusive. For years, the DNA profile sat in databases with no match. Investigators tried everything: re-examining old suspects, re-interviewing witnesses, chasing down distant leads. But the killer had hidden himself well. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: genetic genealogy. In 2018, investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to an open-source genealogy website used by everyday people to trace their ancestry. From there, they built family trees, narrowing down the pool of suspects through distant relatives. DNA, finally. After decades of fear and uncertainty, the name surfaced: Joseph James DeAngelo. A former police officer who had worked in small California towns during the 1970s, DeAngelo had lived an unassuming suburban life. He was a father, a grandfather, and a neighbor, yet behind closed doors, he had been one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. In April 2018, DeAngelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. Neighbors were stunned. The man they had known as a quiet retiree was revealed to be the Golden State Killer. Inside his home, investigators found evidence that tied him to decades of unsolved crimes. The arrest sent shockwaves across the nation. Survivors who had lived with fear and trauma for more than 40 years finally had a name, a face, and an end to their torment. Families of murder victims who had waited in silence for justice now had an answer. In court, Joseph DeAngelo sat silently, frail and diminished. He offered no explanation for his decades of terror. In 2020, he pled guilty to 13 murders and 13 related kidnappings, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for life in prison without parole. During sentencing, survivors and family members stood before him, recounting the horrors he had inflicted. Their voices carried decades of pain, but also resilience. The courtroom became a place not of fear, but of closure. For many, the trial was a final chapter in a story that had haunted them for most of their lives. Though justice had come late, it had come at last. The Golden State Killer would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of control, stripped of power, and stripped of the anonymity that had shielded him for so long. The story of the Golden State Killer is not just a tale of violence. It is a testament to persistence, the relentless dedication of detectives, the power of modern science, and the resilience of survivors who refused to be silenced by fear. It also stands as a reminder of how deeply one individual's cruelty can wound entire communities. For decades, his shadow loomed over California, shaping how people locked their doors, how neighborhoods lived in fear, and how entire generations learned what it meant to be vulnerable in their own homes. But, in the end, the shadow was lifted. Through innovation and perseverance, the man who once thrived on darkness was finally brought into the light. Joseph DeAngelo's arrest didn't erase the horrors he committed, nor did it undo the suffering of his victims, but it gave something vital back to those he had tormented: the truth. And perhaps in that truth lies the most important message of all, that no matter how long evil hides, no matter how far time stretches, justice has a way of catching up. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror is over, but the resilience of those who survived him endures, stronger than the fear he once spread.